Bismillah, in the next section, we're looking at menstruation and postpartum bleeding, al-hayd wal-nifas. Okay? So to look at the word linguistically, al-hayd means to flow. Legally, it refers to the natural blood of pubescent women which flows from the womb at regular intervals. The ruling of menstruation is something agreed upon by way of consensus, and it's based on a number of things. First and foremost, the verse in the Quran, verse number 222 of Surah Al-Baqarah, which means, and they ask you about menstruation, they ask you about al-hayd. Say it is adha. It's like harm or hardship, difficulty. So keep away from your wives or keep away from wives during menstruation. And we're going to look a little deeper into the verse shortly to understand some more technical meanings or conclusions from the actual wording. It goes on and says, and do not approach them until they are pure, and when they are purified themselves, then come to them from where Allah has ordained for you. Indeed, Allah loves those who are constantly repentant and loves those who purify themselves. You should certainly look up this verse in Arabic so that you can refer to it as we proceed. Another I guess evidence for this is found in Sahih Bukhari. It's the Hadith of Fatima radiallahu anha, which the Prophet ﷺ instructed her to abandon prayer during her menstrual cycle. Okay, so the Imam Mansur ibn Yunus al-Bawti rahimahullah ta'ala begins this chapter, Babun fil haydi wa nifas. He says, Al-haydu yamna'u al-ghusla lahu wal-wudu'a wal-salata wa-wujubaha wa-fi'la sawmin wa-tawafin wa-i'tikafin wa-wat'an fi farjin illa liman bihi shabaqun bi-sharti wa-yajibu bihi dinarun aw nisfuhu kaffara وَيَسْتَمْتِعُ مِنْهَا مَا دُونَ فَرْجٍ. He says, وَيَسْتَمْتِعُ مِنْهَا بِمَا دُونَ فَرْجٍ. Menstruation prohibits the following things. It prevents and prohibits, basically, ghusl, which is required for menstruation. We talked about ghusl, and from the things which obligate the ghusl is the conclusion of the menstrual cycle. Once the menstrual cycle ends, ghusl is something that has to be performed. So this is done after the menstrual blood stops flowing. And so long as it's flowing, it's not possible to achieve the desired state of purity. And so performing ghusl for this cause is invalid. Right? You can't perform the ghusl for menstruation while you're still experiencing an active menstrual cycle. Menstruation does not prevent ghusl due to sexual impurity or the sake of ihram. Okay? You may be thinking, well, wait a minute. How are you going to be engaging in sexual activity, intimacy with your spouse while you're on your menstrual cycle? Well, number one, it could happen. There's an expiation for it. Number two, your menstrual cycle could begin between the time of you having sexual relations with your spouse and performing the ghusl for those relations, right? For that intimacy. And so it began immediately after or shortly thereafter or some time in between then and the ghusl that you were going to take or make or perform due to that intimacy. And the same thing goes for ihram. In these cases and similar cases for ghusl, it is recommended to make the ghusl due to those things. Similar to ghusl, it also prevents wudu, which would be invalid if performed during a menstrual cycle. Right? So remember we talked about wudu and ghusl, and some of the similarities and associations that they share. And here's one of them. You can't make ghusl during your menstrual cycle. You certainly can't make wudu either. It's not valid. Likewise, a menstrual cycle prevents prayer, be it obligatory or voluntary, including any prostrations. Remember the prostrations like sujud tilawa, that for recitation, or shukr for gratitude. We know that those types of prostrations have the same ruling as prayer in a number of their prerequisites, like purity. Doing so during the menstrual cycle would be impermissible because performing an act of worship while there is something preventing its validity is a form of deception, cheating, or playing about. It also prevents its obligation, which foregoes the need to make up any of the 5 daily prayers which are missed during the menstrual cycle. And this is the case because making up prayers, al-qada, is essentially the result of them being obligatory in the first place. Okay, so that's why the Imam mentions that it prevents or prohibits prayer and its obligations. So performing prayer, it prevents and prohibits, and also does the same for the obligatory nature, which basically means that you don't have to make up those prayers later. And the reason why that's important is because in the next thing he says, and this is according to consensus, fasting. Fasting is essentially also prevented during the menstrual cycle. This is based on a hadith which states, the Prophet ﷺ saying, is it not the case that when you women have your menstrual cycle, you do not fast or pray? Addressing a group of women, as reported by Imam Bukhari. Now, this hadith is addressing the act of abandoning fasting, not fasting. And it's not addressing the obligatory nature of fasting. So it's understood that the menstrual cycle does not void the obligatory nature of fasting, and therefore the missed days of fasting must be made up. Okay, unlike prayer. The possible wisdom behind this prohibition is that fasting weakens the body, as does the menstrual cycle. Fasting weakens the body, as does the menstrual cycle. And if they are done together, it could potentially cause too much strain on a woman. And because the aims and intents of the Islamic law include preservation of the body, women are prevented from fasting during this time so that they do not combine two things which weaken the body, fasting and the menstrual cycle. And of course, al-hukm al-ghalib, right? We're talking about a general population. There are going to be exceptions to everything in terms of women's experiences with their own menstrual cycle and with fasting. For some people, it doesn't weaken the body, but typically it does. I'm talking about both fasting or menstrual cycle. Typically, fasting weakens the body, and from what I'm told, okay, and obviously the author here is mentioning this, but from what I'm told, the menstrual cycle does cause some fatigue and some strain on many women who experience it. It also prevents tawaf. This is based on a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha radiallahu anha, when she began her menstrual cycle, he said, do what the pilgrims do, but do not make tawaf until you are purified. Basically, after the cycle is concluded and you have performed the ghusl. This hadith is muttafaqun alayh. And this indicates that tawaf is still an obligation for the menstruating pilgrim. It must be delayed. And this includes the 2 rak'ahs that are offered after it for tawaf. Menstruation also prevents i'tikaf, and this is based on the Prophet ﷺ saying, I do not permit the masjid for either a menstruating woman or person in major sexual impurity. This is collected by Imam Abu Dawood. He goes on and says, and intercourse, meaning and it prevents intercourse, for which there is an expiation due of 1 or 1/2 dinar. Basically, it prevents or prohibits intercourse, and in the event that that occurs, there's an expiation, which we'll talk about shortly. The prohibition here for intercourse during the menstrual cycle is based on the verse mentioned previously, 222 from Surah Al-Baqarah. Here it says, Allah subhanahu what means this is an English translation of the multiple translations that are out there. So keep away from wives during menstruation and do not approach them until they are pure. Here we're talking about al-mahid. Haid is the blood which flows, and al-mahid, it's either referring to the location of the bleeding, which would be the vaginal canal, or it's referring to the time period of the cycle. And believe it or not, the Hanabila, they have a preferred understanding, and we'll get to that shortly when we get to the section which is relevant. It says, except for one experiencing, meaning it prevents intercourse except, as an exception here, for one experiencing and fulfilling the condition of extreme concupiscence. Concupiscence, excuse me, that's a difficult word for me. Concupiscence. Concupiscence is a very strong sexual desire. And the conditions for this that would permit intercourse during a menstrual cycle is that man fears physical harm to the testicles. And if he's unable to satisfy himself sexually and get relief, there will be some type of physical harm. And the way that it's described in the textbooks is that there would be some type of rupture. Another condition would be being unable to relieve such a desire in another manner, another permissible manner. And we'll talk about some of those permissible manners shortly. Or being unable to do so, meaning have intercourse with another wife who's not experiencing her menstrual cycle, or bondservant in the event that that was a reality. And being unable to afford the dowry of a free woman or price of a bondservant. So here you can see some pretty tall, it's a tall order basically. These are some pretty stringent conditions that must be fulfilled in order to make this an exception. The expiation, which we talked about, the Imam mentions 1 or 1/2 dinar, is obligatory when legal intercourse. So legal intercourse, again, is the insertion of the male glands or its equivalent of a 10-year-old or older. Right? So we're talking about what's the bare minimum age that this would be considered, that the man would be considered obliged, right, to pay an expiation. It would be 10 years old. Anything younger than that, I mean, it falls outside of the legal scope here. 10 years and older, even if covered, meaning their glands, into the vagina during any point of menstruation, then the expiation becomes obligatory. And this is based on a hadith of Ibn Abbas. Some people may be thinking, well, I've never heard of this before. You see, the madhab, they just have these things. It just don't make sense, or they don't have evidence. But in reality is, here's a statement. This is Hadith of Ibn Abbas concerning a man who had intercourse with his wife while she was menstruating, which states, let him give a dinar or 1/2 a dinar in charity. And this was collected by Imam Ahmad, Abu Dawood, at-Tirmidhi, and an-Nasa'i. So the heavyweights of hadith collections have collected and narrated this particular hadith regarding the expiation. Now, what is it? What do we do? 1 dinar or 1/2 dinar? What is it? This is an option. The option to give a half or a whole is like the traveler's option to shorten their prayers or complete them. We're not talking about combining prayers. We're talking about shortening the prayers. Do you shorten or complete? Remember, if you studied Hadith of Ibn Umar or any other book, a beginner level book, then you would know the ruling of shortening versus the ruling of combining. They're different rulings. The expiation is obligatory upon the man, even if he was coerced, he was forgetful, or ignorant of the presence of menstrual blood in this particular ruling. Okay, so in all cases. If the woman obliges the man, basically, participates willingly, the woman must also pay just as the man. Even if she obliges him, if she was forgetful or ignorant of the presence of menstrual blood, and the ruling of this expiation, and the ruling that it's impermissible to have intercourse during menstrual cycle, even if she didn't know, she would still be obliged to pay as well. So basically, both of them would be paying. The only exception for the woman is if she was coerced. And in the event that she was coerced, there would be no expiation due from her. A little bit more about this expiation. Like all expiations, it is given to a zakat recipient who is in need. Giving it to one person will suffice, like you can give your zakat to one person and not have to distribute it to many people. And it's voided if not possible at the time of intercourse. So when you had intercourse during a menstrual cycle, you didn't have the money to pay for that expiation, it's voided, it's foregone. You don't have to do it. You don't have to now wait until you can afford it. If you had the money to pay it then, it's obligatory. If you didn't have the money to pay it then, it's foregone. You don't have to wait to go earn that type of money to then pay it off later. The obligation is either to be fulfilled, or I should say the obligation is based on your capacity and capability at that time. And it's treated like intercourse during the days of fasting in terms of how many are due in the event the act is repeated during a single menstrual cycle. Just as there is an expiation for every day of Ramadan, there is an expiation for every menstrual cycle. And you can certainly refer to the expiations of Ramadan for intercourse, as those course videos are already available. We move on here. It says, the body of a woman or her menstrual cycle is pure, and so a man, well, this is where we get to the point, this is what Imam al-Bahuti says, a man who's permitted, obviously, can enjoy her in all ways except vaginally. So a man can enjoy his wife, various different acts of foreplay or whatever it may be, so long as it's not actual intercourse. And this includes things like hugging and kissing, or her helping him reach climax with her thighs or her hand, etc. So that would go back to that issue of if the man is extremely, is experiencing extreme desire, his wife can assist him in that way during her menstrual cycle, so long as it is not actual intercourse. And so then that would obviously address some of those conditions for making intercourse an exception to the rule, right? So here you can see that you can continue to be intimate with your wife, or you as a woman with your husband, with the exception of vaginal intercourse. This is based on the above mentioned verse. Again, we go back to 222 in Surah Al-Baqarah. Here it says, keep away from wives during menstruation here, but what was intended by this translation was to try and capture the essence. It's not a linguistic word-for-word translation. Al-Mahid is, according to Ibn Abbas, the interpretation of this verse is to keep away from from vaginal intercourse. Al-Mahid, which is what is apparent from reports of Imam Ahmad, is known as Ism Makan. Mahid is what is known as Ism Makan, and refers explicitly to a location. Okay, as we talked about before, it could either be a location or a time period. But we're talking about the location itself, which we know is the vaginal cavity. And so you have to stay away from the vaginal cavity, which permits you to touch or be intimate with your wife in any other way, as described. It's perfectly permissible. Other forms of intimacy are permitted, but during those acts, it is recommended to cover the vaginal cavity, or cover that area during those activities to prevent possible infraction. Okay? The author only mentioned 8 things which are prevented or prohibited by menstrual cycle. There are, however, a number of other things, and they have been mentioned in more expansive works such as Al-Muntaha and Al-Iqna'. So you should understand that this list by Imam al-Bahuti is not an exhaustive list. There are other things that you would have to know about, which perhaps would be covered in a later course. He goes on in the text, he says, وَإِذَا انْقَطَعَ لَمْ يُبَحْ قَبْلَ غُسْلٍ غَيْرُ صَوْمٍ وَطَلَاقٍ وَتَقْضِيَ الصَّوْمَ لَا الصَّلَاةَ وَلَا حَيْضَ قَبْلَ 9 سِنِينَ وَلَا بَعْدَ 50 سَنَةٍ ولا مع حمل وأقله يوم وليلة وأكثره 15 وغالبه 6 أو 7. Nothing which is prohibited during the menstrual cycle is permitted before performing a ghusl or tayammum, in the event that using water is not an option. If the menstrual blood, ceases, it stops flowing, and there's an exception for this, of course, fasting and divorce. Basically, everything that is everything that is impermissible to do during the menstrual cycle is not permitted until ghusl is performed. Okay, so an example would be intercourse. The menstrual blood stops flowing, menstrual cycle's over. You're not permitted to have intercourse until the ghusl is made. The ghusl for the menstrual cycle, to reach or to achieve a state of purity from that menstrual cycle, or anything else with the exception of fasting and divorce. If the blood ceases to flow before Fajr, moments before Fajr prayer, then the woman is permitted to make the intention to fast. This is also the case with sexual impurity in the event that, Fajr prayer is coming and you're going to fast while you're in a state of janaba, sexual impurity. The requirement to perform the ghusl, it does not impede one from fasting. Divorce is also permitted because the reason for its prohibition is prolonging the waiting period. And when the menstrual cycle is concluded, then that reasoning no longer applies because it no longer exists. Divorcing a woman, should be noted, during her menstrual cycle is an impermissible innovation, as opposed to her request for a khula or an exchange-based divorce, where she asks for talaq with some type of exchange, which it's very similar to the khula, which is, where she basically wants to end her marriage, and she's going to give back something like the dowry or a portion thereof, agreed by the husband. So again, so that you're clear, talaq during a divorce does count as a talaq. It is, however, impermissible and considered an innovation, but it does count. So it's something to take note of, the proper way to do that, and when it actually counts. And this will be talked about in greater detail when we get to that chapter on divorce. Imam al-Buhuti says fasting is to be made up but not prayer. This is based on what was explained previously. And there's another hadith of Mu'adh in which he asked, or which he said, I asked Aisha radiallahu anha, what is the reason that a menstruating woman completes the fasts that she abandons during her monthly cycle, basically, but she does not complete the prayers? She says, are you a haruriya? Haruriya? Remember that word? He said, I'm not a haruriya, but I simply want to inquire. I want to know. She said, during the Prophet's time, we experienced our menstrual cycles, and we were ordered to make up the fast, but we're not ordered to make up the prayers. This is muttafaqun alayh. Here, her saying, are you a haruriya? What does that mean? This was a term used as a rebuke. It refers to Harura, and this was a land, an area associated with the Khawarij. So this is one of the words that were used as a term to identify the Khawarij, Haruriya. And they believed that women had to make up their prayers that were missed during their menstrual cycle. Obviously, this is a false understanding, and it demonstrated their shallow understanding of the faith, to the degree, their shallow understanding of the faith, it was so shallow to the degree that they ended up passing right through the faith. The exception to this is the 2 units of prayer after tawaf, as I mentioned before. That even while you're on your menstrual cycle, if you're fulfilling the rites of the pilgrimage, you have to delay the tawaf. Or let's say, for example, you make the tawaf and then your menstrual cycle starts before you are able to perform those 2 units of prayer, then they have to be performed after the woman concludes her menstrual cycle. So as we talked about the wisdom regarding not making up the fasts, look a little bit further into that. The likely wisdom of this ruling, meaning having to make up prayers but not fasts. Having to make up fasts but not prayer. I'm not a haruriya. The likely wisdom of this ruling is the repetitive nature of the woman's menstrual cycle. Right, so the woman's menstrual cycle, as we'll come to know, even the Islamic ruling here is that it happens on a monthly basis, typically. Typically it happens on a monthly basis. It may not, and it's no problem if it doesn't. It's repetitive, though, for most women. Because it's regularly occurring, it's not obligatory to make up the missed prayers, right? Because it becomes difficult because it's regular. Unlike fasting the month of Ramadan that comes around once a year, the menstrual cycle might be from 6 to 7 days, as we'll come to see, as a general rule. And so to make up 6 or 7 fasts after that, when you have the duration of 11 more months to do so, it's not a great burden. Whereas prayer every month could be cumbersome. And postpartum bleeding is lumped with this, by the way, this ruling that the prayers that are missed during postpartum bleeding are not to be made up, not required to be made up. And someone may say, hey, well, guess what? Postpartum bleeding is not regularly occurring, and so the wisdom or the logic doesn't apply here. And you would be correct, because it's not regularly occurring. However, postpartum bleeding is typically very long. The maximum is 40 days. So the concept of being merciful, it still applies here. And so it's been classed with menstrual bleeding in this regard. The Imam says there is no menstrual blood before a full 9 hijrah years of age. Remember, all of the ages, whether that's the age of tamyiz or puberty or things of this nature, like here we're talking about when does the menstruation actually start, when does it end technically, they're all in the hijrah calendar. So we're not talking about Gregorian years. You know, if you're like 10 in the Gregorian calendar, you could, or 9, I should say, if you're 9 in the Gregorian calendar, you're actually older in the hijrah calendar. So here, menstruation, there's no menstruation before a full 9 hijrah years of age, meaning legally there's no menstruation. If you were to see blood, a girl younger than 9 hijrah years of age were to see blood, then it would be considered something else. If she sees that according to Islamic law, because there was no woman found that had a menstrual cycle at an early age, it's not considered menstrual blood legally. Aisha radiallahu anha, she says when a girl reaches 9 years of age, she's a woman. It's reported by Imam at-Tirmidhi in Hadith. This indicates that when a girl of this age sees blood flow, which is like menstrual blood, it is deemed as such, meaning it's deemed to be menstrual blood. And she is thus deemed to be pubescent, and all of the relevant rulings apply to her. There's also no menstruation after 50 years of age in the Hijrah calendar. This is the legal application of the law when it comes to the natural blood of women, menstrual cycle. Its minimum is 9, its maximum is 50. Before 9, it's considered, legally considered a different type of blood, and after 50, legally it's considered a different type of blood, and the rulings are different to that. A person may say, well, yeah, there are some girls that are reported to have gotten a menstrual cycle before 9, and there are some women that they experience a monthly menstrual cycle after 50, right? However, it should be understood that the law of Islam is based on certain frameworks, revelation being the primary one of those, divine inspiration, guidance from the Prophet ﷺ, and obviously agreement within the scholarly tradition, starting with the companions. Okay, in this regard, we don't take into consideration physiology or biology. We understand the menstrual cycle is a biological thing that's acknowledged in our tradition, but when it comes to applying Islamic legal rulings, then this is what we have in the madhab, 9 to 50. And this, of course, is regardless of her ethnicity, whether she's Arab or non-Arab, because some of the scholars have differentiated between the two, saying that Arab women typically would have longer menstrual cycles. And this is, again, based on the statement of Aisha, if a woman reached age 50, she passed the limit of menstruation. This was collected by Imam Ahmed. Okay. There's also no menstruation during pregnancy. So no menstruation before 9, after 50, during pregnancy. And this is based on the Hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. This is traced to the Prophet ﷺ, who said regarding the captives taken at Atwas, there must be no intercourse with a pregnant woman till she gives birth to her child, or with the one who is not pregnant until she has had one menstrual period, one menstrual cycle. Collected by Imam Ahmad and Abu Dawud. In this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ acknowledged menstruation as a legal indication that the womb was empty, meaning there was no child, which is an indication that the two do not occur at the same time, meaning pregnancy and menstruation, they do not occur at the same time. If a woman were to see blood during pregnancy, she should consider it defect blood. Defect blood, which is known as dem fasad. Dem fasad. So there's different types of blood. And the first one we talked about is al-hayd. And now we're talking about dem fasad. And eventually we're going to talk about, we've also indicated to nifas, which is postpartum bleeding. And then eventually we're going to talk about what is called istihada, which is pseudo-menstruation. So she should consider this dem fasad, which is defect blood, continue to pray, and enjoy intimacy with her spouse as desired. It's recommended to perform ghusl after this category of blood ceases to flow, even though it's not considered menstrual blood or obviously postpartum blood. It's still considered recommended to perform the ghusl after that dam fasad stops flowing. Its shortest duration is 1 day and night. This is based on a statement of Ali. He said the shortest menstrual cycle is a day and a night, or the equivalent amount of time. So what's intended here is like a 24-hour period from the time the blood flows. So basically, if the blood flows less than a 24-hour period, it's not considered menstrual blood. It's considered defect blood, dam fasad. It's not menstrual blood. Its longest duration is 15 days and nights. This is also based on the statement of Ali. Whatever exceeds 15 is pseudo-menstruation. This is called istihada. He says, and the shortest menstrual cycle is a day and a night. So that's the complete statement of Ali radiallahu anhu. Okay, so what's interesting to me is, considering our current cultural context, you find that the narrations here are related from both men and women. So women talking about their menstrual cycle, Aisha radiallahu anha being one, Hadith of Fatima, for example, as well as men talking about menstrual cycles of women, talking about some of the legal ramifications of menstrual cycles. So, it's something that it's specific to women, obviously, but the knowledge of the menstrual cycle and its legal rulings, are not restricted in terms of discussion and learning and reminding and teaching are not restricted to one gender over the other. Should not be dominated by men talking about the rulings of menstrual cycle, and it certainly will not be monopolized by women. That you say, look, you're a male, even if you're a scholar, you know about these things. You don't have the right to talk about menstrual cycles. Look, there's no doubt that men do not experience them, and so that is the realm of women for sure. However, the legal rulings are as they are, and they're open for everyone to know and learn. And it's very important for fathers, brothers, husbands to understand the rulings in the event that their mothers, their wives, their aunties, their daughters need support in learning the rulings and how to apply them. So Ali says whatever exceeds 15 is pseudo-menstruation, and the shortest menstrual cycle is a day and a night. The maximum limit is what is most apparent of the madhab, meaning 15. 15 days is a maximum, meaning that after 15 days and nights, if you're still experiencing blood, it's no longer considered legally menstrual blood. It's now considered something else. It's istihada at this point. And so the ruling changes. This maximum limit is what is most apparent of the madhab. And to further support this conclusion, there's a hadith of Ibn Umar. Again, look, the hadith is very, comprehensive in the way that this is understood. The Prophet ﷺ in one hadith says, and some women will go half of their life not praying. Some women will go half of their life not praying. This is an indication that 15 days and nights, which is half a month, is the longest duration. Some women, not all women, will go half their life not praying. All women that have a menstrual cycle, that is, will go some portion of their life not praying. But here he says some women will go half their life. And so it's basically like the Prophet ﷺ saying the most a woman would go is half her life not praying. And half of your life is half of all the months that you live, meaning if you have a menstrual cycle, the maximum that it would be is half of that month until your menstrual cycle concluded at the age of 50. Right, so this indication that 15 days and nights, which is half a month, is the longest duration. And any blood that is seen beyond that time frame is therefore considered pseudo-menstruation istihada. The Imam says its average duration is 6 or 7 days and nights. This is based on the Prophet ﷺ saying to Hamna, who experienced a very heavy and irregular flow, to observe her menstrual cycle for 6 or 7 days and then perform ghusl and pray for 23 or 24 days, as was typical of the women in that community. This was collected by Imam Ahmad, Abu Dawood, at-Tirmidhi, and Ibn Majah. Not only does this hadith indicate the average menstrual cycle, but also the average time of purity, right? The average time of purity is going to be 23 or 24 days of the month, and there is no maximum time frame for purity, meaning A woman could go months or years without having a menstrual cycle, and she would be in a state of purity, meaning would not be required to perform ghusl due to a menstrual cycle because she had not had one. So it's not something that has to be done every month, because you don't, if you don't have a menstrual cycle, and that should be understood, because it is something that does happen and is more common than one might imagine. And that is where we will conclude with this section. And next we will look at, in the next class, we will look at how to begin determining your regular menstrual cycle, as well as pseudomenstruation and postpartum bleeding.